Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material. I want you to picture a scene in your mind right now.
Okay, set the stage for us.
Think of a modern, incredibly corrupt corporate billionaire. We're talking about someone who has made his absolute fortune by exploiting his own community.
Right, like totally untouchable.
Exactly. He's despised, and he normally travels surrounded by private security. He's operating entirely behind the tinted glass of a luxury SUV.
He's completely isolated from the people he's exploiting.
Yeah, exactly. Now, I want you to imagine that same man wearing like a bespoke tailored suit, awkwardly bypassing his own security detail.
Okay, that's a wild image.
Right. He is running down a crowded, dusty public street and desperately shimmying up a city lamppost just to catch a glimpse of a famous street philosopher walking by. It is this massive, almost comical subversion of dignity, status, and gravity. I mean, a man of that wealth simply does not run, and he certainly doesn't climb things like an excited child.
No, they absolutely don't. And that image, it perfectly captures the jarring reality of where our source material begins today.
Yeah.
We are looking at a human landscape that is completely unpredictable. You know, when we look at a blueprint for a house, there is an expectation of clean precision. We expect the lines on the walls and the foundations to make perfect logical sense.
Right. Everything is in its place.
Exactly. But when you step into the actual lived experience of that house, when the foundation cracks or, when a storm hits or the people inside it face a massive crisis, that clean blueprint suddenly feels totally inadequate.
It really does.
We write these neat little scripts for our lives, mapping out our careers, our relationships, our safety. But when life refuses to follow the script, we experience this profound disorientation.
And that disorientation, that's exactly what we are navigating today. We are acting as your guides on a custom-tailored deep dive into the biblical book of Luke, specifically chapters 19 through 24.
It's an intense section.
It is. And our mission is to extract the practical wisdom, the moral insight, and the life application from this ancient text. To do this, we are drawing heavily on the historical commentaries of Matthew Henry and Albert Barnes alongside the World English Bible text.
Right.
We want to take these ancient words and translate them into a framework you could actually use in the 21st century.
Which is so needed, because this specific section of the text, it provides an incredibly rich diagnostic of the human condition. It covers the final climactic days of Jesus' life.
Yeah, the tension is just ramping up the whole time.
It really is. The narrative arc we're exploring moves from the dusty, chaotic roads of Jericho directly into the intense political and religious clashes of Jerusalem.
Right into the hornet's nest.
Exactly. And from there, we walk through the profound systemic crisis of the crucifixion, and finally, we end up on the perspective-shattering road to Emmaus. It is a journey that it starts with personal economics, scales up to systemic power, descends into unimaginable suffering, and culminates in a complete reinterpretation of reality.
Okay, let's unpack this. We begin on that road to Jerusalem with a story about money, power, and personal transformation. It's a narrative that demonstrates how a true internal shift fundamentally alters our relationship with the material world.
Yes.
We are looking at Luke chapter 19 and the story of a man named Zacchaeus. Now, to understand the gravity of that billionaire up a lamppost analogy I used earlier, we really have to understand the specific economic mechanics of who this guy was.
The historical and human context is vital here.
Yeah.
The text describes Zacchaeus as a chief among the publicans and notes simply that he was rich. Now, he lived in Jericho, and at that time, Jericho was a massively wealthy city.
It's a huge trade hub, right?
Oh, absolutely. Major hub, particularly famous for its balsam trade. So Zacchaeus wasn't just some low-level guy sitting at a toll booth out in the middle of nowhere. He was essentially a regional receiver general.
Wow.
He collaborated directly with the occupying Roman forces through a system called tax farming.
Right, let's break down how that tax farming actually worked, because it wasn't, like modern taxation where you get a standardized bill from the government in the mail.
Not at all. It was so much more corrupt. The Romans essentially auctioned off the right to collect taxes in a specific region.
Okay.
A chief publican like Zacchaeus would win the contract by promising to pay Rome a fixed, exorbitant amount of money up front, or at least on a strict schedule.
So Rome gets their cut no matter what.
Exactly. Once Rome got their money, they did not care how Zacchaeus got his. So Zacchaeus and his whole network of subcollectors would go out and demand vastly more than what was actually owed. And anything they collected over the Roman quota was pure, unregulated profit. It was basically an authorized mafia. The system inherently incentivized systemic extortion.
So he is getting insanely wealthy by literally draining the livelihoods of his own neighbors to fund an oppressive empire.
Yes.
All while skimming a massive fortune off the top for his own private estate.
That's exactly it. And the social cost of that was absolute isolation. He was deeply, deeply despised by his own people.
Which makes total sense.
Right. He was categorized by the religious establishment not just as a political traitor, but as a sinner in the absolute worst, most unclean sense of the word. Matthew Henry actually points out the bitter irony of his name.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it derives from the Hebrew Zacchaeus, which means pure.
Oh, wow. The pure one.
Exactly. Yet in reality, he was considered completely untouchable.
Which brings us back to that lamppost image. The text says Zacchaeus sought to see Jesus, but he was little of stature and he couldn't see over the massive crowd. So he runs ahead and climbs up into a sycamore tree.
Yeah, and Matthew Henry has a great observation here. He notes that Zacchaeus forgot his gravity because he would not disappoint his curiosity.
I love that.
There is something profoundly vulnerable about a man who has spent his entire life building a fortress of wealth and intimidation, suddenly abandoning all protocol just to see a teacher walking by.
It's completely out of character.
It is! And Jesus' response is equally disruptive. He doesn't ignore the man, nor does he use the moment to, publicly shame him for his corruption to win points with the crowd.
Which is what everyone probably expected him to do.
Right. But instead, Jesus stops, looks up, calls him by his name, and says, "Zacchaeus, make haste and come down, for today I must abide at thy house." He literally invites himself over.
And the crowd's reaction is exactly what you would expect. They murmur, they complain. I mean, they are outraged that Jesus has gone to be a guest with a man who is the architect of their financial suffering.
Yeah, they're furious.
But here is the core wisdom, the actual mechanism of transformation that happens inside that house. Jesus doesn't walk into the dining room, slam his fist on the table, and demand a massive check for his ministry.
Right.
He doesn't pull out the Torah and audit Zacchaeus' corrupt ledgers line by line. Simply being in the proximity of truth and grace inspires Zacchaeus to stand up on his own volition.
That internal shift.
Exactly. He stands up and declares, "Behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor, and if I have taken anything from any man by false accusation, I restore him fourfold."
We really need to pause and look at the math of that statement, because it is a staggering economic shockwave.
Yeah, let's run the numbers.
Giving half of his wealth to the poor immediately halves his net worth.
Wow.
Gone. Then, out of the remaining 50%, he pledges a fourfold restitution to anyone he defrauded.
Which was probably almost everyone in town.
Exactly. Matthew Henry notes this mirrors the absolute maximum penalty for a thief in the law of Exodus, specifically for stealing a sheep. Zacchaeus isn't waiting for a class action lawsuit. He isn't making some philanthropic pledge to be fulfilled by his estate after he dies. He is actively, aggressively dismantling the wealth he built on exploitation.
I mean, that level of restitution would likely bankrupt him. It completely destroys the syndicate he built.
It does, and that is the point. He realizes that true repentance, a genuine change of heart, inevitably results in a change of action and a change of economics. He can no longer hoard what he obtained unjustly.
The internal shift is so profound that the external ledger has to be rewritten.
Yes, precisely.
It is the ultimate proof of a changed life. He isn't trying to buy his salvation with a dramatic gesture. His healing has freed him from the desperate, fearful need to hoard and steal.
Exactly.
And Jesus responds by saying, "This day is salvation come to this house." And what is fascinating is how Jesus immediately follows this up. He tells a parable that connects directly to this idea of how we view our resources in the world around us. It's the parable of the minas.
Albert Barnes, in his commentary, notes that the context for this parable is vital. The crowd traveling with Jesus was highly anticipating that the kingdom of God was going to immediately appear in Jerusalem as a temporal political power.
Right. They thought the revolution was starting tomorrow.
Exactly. They were ready for a new government. So Jesus is checking those expectations. He tells a story about a nobleman who goes into a far country to receive a kingdom. Before he leaves, he gives 10 of his servants 10 minas.
It's just a lot of money, right?
It's a significant amount of capital, yeah. Roughly 3 years' wages for a standard laborer. And he gives them a simple command. Occupy, which in the original language means to trade or do business till I come.
He is basically saying, look, I am going away for a while, and you're going to be left here in the messy reality of the world to work, to invest, and to grow what I have entrusted to you.
Exactly.
When the nobleman finally returns, he calls the servants in for an audit. The first has turned his mina into 10, and he is rewarded with massive authority, rule over 10 cities.
All right.
The second turned his into 5 and gets 5 cities. But the focus of the parable, the guy who really demands our attention, is the third servant, the one who buried his mina in a napkin.
This servant's explanation for his failure is incredibly revealing. He says, "Lord, behold, here is thy pound, which I have kept laid up in a napkin, for I feared thee, because thou art an austere man. Thou takest up that thou layest not down, and reapest that thou didst not sow."
Let's dissect that word austere, because the psychology here is just so relatable to modern life.
Barnes explains that austere means hard, severe, oppressive. The Greek root implies something that is bitter or sour to the taste, like unripe fruit.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. This servant viewed his master as a harsh, exploitative taskmaster. He fundamentally believed the system was rigged against him. He thought, if I invest this and lose it, he will destroy me. If I invest it and make a profit, he will just take it anyway.
So he just freezes.
Right. Because he was paralyzed by the fear of an unjust authority, he did absolutely nothing. His failure wasn't just laziness, it was a deeply flawed theology. He had a toxic worldview that paralyzed his potential.
How often do we operate out of that exact same austere worldview? Think about it. Viewing God or life or the economy or the universe as a harsh, rigged system that is just waiting around the corner to punish you for making a mistake.
All the time.
That fearful theology leads directly to a hoarding mentality. You take your talents, your resources, your time, your emotional energy, and you wrap it all up in a protective napkin and bury it in the dirt.
Wow, yeah.
You don't risk loving someone deeply. You don't risk starting that creative project. You don't risk radical generosity because you are terrified of the austere master.
The irony is that the nobleman condemns the servant using his own twisted logic. He points out that if the servant truly believed the master was that demanding, he should have at least put the money in the bank to earn baseline interest.
Right, at least do the bare minimum.
Exactly. The master exposes the fact that the servant's fear was ultimately just a convenient excuse for reigning indifference. The fear became a shield to avoid engaging with the world at all.
The contrast Jesus paints later in Luke 21 is breathtaking when you hold it up against this fearful hoarding. Jesus is sitting in the temple, watching people put their gifts into the treasury.
Yeah, this is a famous scene.
The wealthy are throwing in large amounts, essentially, tipping God out of their surplus. But then a poor widow walks up and casts in 2 small brass mites lepta, which together were worth perhaps a fraction of a single day's wage.
And Jesus declares that she has put in more than all of them combined. Why? Because they gave out of their abundance, but she gave out of her poverty. She put in all the living she had.
It's incredible.
If we look at the underlying mechanism of her action, it is the exact opposite of the wicked servant. She did not view God as an austere man. She viewed God as her ultimate security, her provider, which completely freed her from the fear of lack.
Look at the spectrum we've just covered here. Zacchaeus was absurdly rich, and his transformation led to giving half his goods and paying 4-fold restitution, completely dismantling his empire.
Right.
The widow was profoundly impoverished, and she freely gave her last 2 coins. And then the wicked servant had a solid capital investment handed to him, and he buried it in the dirt out of sheer terror.
The through line here is that your internal perception of reality dictates your external economy. If you believe life is generous and redemptive, you become generous and redemptive. If you believe life is a harsh trap, you become a hoarder.
That leads us to the practical how-to for this first section, which we call the ledger audit. And this isn't just about your bank account. I want you to sit down this week and honestly reflect on how you are managing all your resources.
Your money, your time, your relational bandwidth.
Exactly, your creative talents. Look at where you spend your energy. Are you operating out of an austere worldview? Are you hiding your gifts in a napkin out of fear of failure, fear of rejection, or fear of scarcity?
Such a good question.
Or, like Zacchaeus, are you willing to make radical restitution where you've caused harm and give generously, recognizing that all resources are entrusted to you for the benefit of others? How does your personal ledger reflect your actual belief about the generosity of life?
Taking an honest look at that ledger is uncomfortable, but it's really necessary because the narrative doesn't stay in the realm of personal economics for long. The camera pans out.
Yeah. It scales up quickly.
It does. Jesus leaves Jericho, travels up the road, and officially arrives in Jerusalem, shifting his focus from our personal ledgers to the very heart of systemic institutional power.
And the way he enters Jerusalem is iconic. He rides in on a donkey, which fulfills ancient prophecy, and the crowds are in an absolute frenzy, throwing their cloaks on the road and praising him.
Right, the triumphal entry.
But the destination he chooses is incredibly revealing. He doesn't ride to the Roman Praetorium. He doesn't go to the political palace. He goes straight to the religious epicenter, the temple. And he doesn't go there to pray quietly. He begins to cast out the buyers and sellers, declaring, "My house is the house of prayer, but ye have made it a den of thieves."
He is directly confronting the religious economic complex of his day. Matthew Henry points out that by doing this, Jesus showed he had a truer, deeper love for the temple than the religious leaders who controlled it. They valued the temple for its wealth, its treasury, and specifically a system known as Corban.
We need to define that. What exactly was the Corban system, and how were these merchants turning the temple into a den of thieves? Because it wasn't just, people selling cheap souvenirs.
Far from it. Corban was a practice where wealth or property was dedicated as a gift to God, effectively putting it into the temple treasury. But the religious leaders had created a highly lucrative racket around the sacrificial system.
Okay, how did the racket work?
Well, if a worshiper traveled miles to Jerusalem and brought their own sheep for sacrifice, the temple inspectors would almost certainly declare it blemished and unfit.
Of course they would.
Right. The worshiper would then be forced to buy a certified unblemished sheep directly from the temple merchants at an extortionate markup.
And they couldn't even use normal money to buy it.
Correct. You couldn't use Roman denarii to buy temple goods or pay the temple tax because the Roman coins bore the image of Caesar, which was considered idolatrous.
Ah, right.
So worshippers had to exchange their Roman currency for specific Tyrian shekels. The money changers sitting in the temple courtyard charged massive predatory exchange rates for this service.
It's just a total monopoly.
Exactly. The entire apparatus was designed to siphon wealth from devoted, often poor pilgrims into the pockets of the priestly aristocracy. When Jesus drives them out, he isn't just making a theological point about reverence, he is literally disrupting their supply chain. He is cutting off the massive revenue stream of the chief priests.
You can imagine how well that goes over. The establishment immediately wants to destroy him, but they have a massive PR problem. He is incredibly popular with the common people.
Very true.
The crowds are hanging on his every word. The religious leaders know that if they just arrest him in broad daylight, there will be a massive riot. So they had to get crafty. They decide to use the political system against him.
Luke 20 details this trap. The religious leaders send spies who, according to the text, feigned themselves just men. They put on a brilliant disguise of sincere intellectual inquiry.
They're acting like eager students.
Right. They approach Jesus with what seems like a standard theological debate, but is actually a lethal snare. They ask him, "Is it lawful for us to give tribute unto Caesar or no?"
I want to make something crystal clear to you, the listener, before we dive into the mechanics of this trap. We are examining this text to extract its ancient wisdom regarding power and allegiance. We must explicitly maintain complete political neutrality here. The principles we are discussing apply impartially to all modern political dynamics,
Right.
whether you lean left-wing, right-wing, or anywhere else. Our deep dive takes no sides in modern partisan politics. We are simply purporting the profound insight of this ancient interaction and how it challenges human authority across the board.
That neutrality is essential because the wisdom in Jesus' response completely transcends partisan divides. To understand the brilliance of the trap, you have to look at the legal and social mechanics of first-century Judea.
Right.
Judea was a conquered, occupied territory. The Jewish people deeply resented paying the poll tax to Rome. It was a visceral daily reminder of their subjugation. So the spies have created a perfect dilemma.
A total catch-22.
Exactly. If Jesus answers, yes, it is lawful to pay taxes to Caesar, he instantly alienates his entire base of support. The massive crowds hoping for a revolutionary messiah will turn on him as a Roman sympathizer.
But if he answers, no, it is not lawful, the trap snaps shut the other way. The spies have witnesses. They can immediately run to Pilate, the Roman governor, and have Jesus arrested, tried, and executed for sedition and leading a tax revolt against the Roman Empire.
Yep.
Say yes, lose the crowd. Say no, get crucified by the state.
It is a masterful piece of political chess. But Jesus sees entirely through their flattery. He doesn't answer with a yes or a no. He asks them for a prop. He says, "Show me a penny." a Roman denarius.
Okay.
They hand him the coin, and he asks a remarkably simple question. Whose image and superscription hath it? They answer the obvious. Caesar's. Then he delivers a line that has shaped political philosophy for 2 millennia. Render therefore unto Caesar the things which be Caesar's, and unto God the things which be God's.
He completely reframes the entire nature of what we owe to the state versus what we owe to our creator.
Exactly. Let's look at the logic of his argument. By producing the Roman coin from their own pockets, the spies admit they are participating in the Roman economy.
Right, they have the money on them.
Yes, they are using Caesar's infrastructure. If you use the emperor's money, you acknowledge a certain level of civic obligation. Fulfill your civic duties, pay the tax, give the metal disc back to the man whose face is stamped on it.
But it's the second half of that sentence that drops the hammer. And unto God the things which be God's. If the coin belongs to Caesar because it has Caesar's image minted on it, what belongs to God?
Humanity. Because the foundational claim of the ancient Hebrew scriptures going all the way back to Genesis is that human beings are uniquely created in the image of God.
Wow.
The profound wisdom here is the strict limitation of state power. Caesar can have a percentage of your money because he minted it, but Caesar cannot have your soul.
That is so powerful.
He cannot have your conscience. He cannot demand your ultimate, unquestioning allegiance. Those bear the image of the divine. Matthew Henry summarizes this beautifully, noting that in civil things we submit to civil powers, but in sacred things, God only is our king. The state is not absolute.
It is a massive challenge to how we view power and hierarchy. And what makes this so incredibly poignant is what happens shortly after this. Jesus has just dismantled the corrupt power structures of the temple, and he has just put the Roman Empire in its proper limited place.
Yeah.
We move to Luke 22. It is the Last Supper, the very night before Jesus is going to be tortured and executed. And what are his closest disciples doing? They get into a heated argument about who among them should be accounted the greatest.
It's unbelievable.
They're still arguing about cabinet positions in an earthly kingdom.
It is an almost comedic display of missing the point. They are completely tone deaf to the reality of the moment. Jesus has to once again contrast the brutal nature of worldly power with the kingdom he is actually establishing. He tells them, the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and they that exercise authority upon them are called benefactors.
The word benefactors is so key. It wasn't just a generic compliment.
No, the Greek word used there is euergetons. It was an actual official title adopted by Hellenistic kings, particularly the Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt.
That is the ultimate public relations spin. A king brings his army, conquers your land, taxes you into absolute poverty, uses your money to build a massive marble statue of himself in the city square, and then demands that you address him as your benefactor.
Right.
They mask their violent domination as a benevolent public service.
And Jesus completely inverts that entire pyramid of power. He looks at his disciples who are salivating over the idea of being benefactors, and he says, but ye shall not be so. But he that is greatest among you, let him be as the younger, and he that is chief as he that doth serve.
He flips it completely upside down.
He does. He grounds this in his own reality, pointing out that he is among them as one who waits on tables. In the framework he is building, true leadership isn't about looking great, accumulating titles, or demanding compliance. It is defined entirely by genuine service to the needs of others.
Which brings us to the practical how-to for this section. We call it the towel check. I want you to look at your own life, your role in your workplace, your dynamics in your family, your position in community organizations.
Yeah, take a hard look.
Are you secretly striving for the title of benefactor? Are you trying to accumulate titles, leverage, and authority so that people will finally serve you and recognize your greatness? This week, how can you practically take the posture of the one waiting tables?
It's a great challenge.
How can you use whatever authority or influence you currently hold to genuinely serve the people under your care rather than demanding they serve your ego?
Making that pivot from demanding service to offering it is incredibly difficult, but it is deeply necessary for what comes next, because the narrative is about to descend into a period of extreme, destabilizing crisis.
Yeah, the tone shifts dramatically here.
Having confronted the corrupt institutions of Jerusalem, Jesus now clearly predicts their inevitable violent collapse. And in doing so, he offers profound psychological survival tactics for anyone facing chaotic times.
The descent into crisis begins with a deeply emotional moment. Back in Luke 19, as Jesus is initially approaching Jerusalem and seeing the sweeping view of the city, he stops and he weeps over it. He says, "If thou hadst known, even thou, at least in this thy day, the things which belong unto thy peace, but now they're hid from thine eyes. He isn't weeping out of self-pity. He is weeping because he accurately foresees the brutal destruction that is coming.
The historical context here is grim and terrifying. He predicts that enemies will cast a trench about the city, compass it round, and lay it even with the ground, leaving not one stone upon another.
Which is exactly what happens.
Yes. Both Matthew Henry and Albert Barnes connect this prophecy directly to the catastrophic Roman siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD under the command of Titus.
For those who might not know the history of that siege, it was one of the most horrific events in antiquity.
It was apocalyptic for the Jewish people. The Roman legions literally built a circumvallation wall, a trench, and a palisade completely surrounding the city to starve it out.
Horrifying.
The internal factions inside Jerusalem fought each other, burning their own food supplies. Hundreds of thousands of people died from starvation, disease, and crucifixion. And ultimately, the massive, spectacular temple, the center of their universe, was burned and completely leveled.
Total destruction.
Jesus weeps because he knows they missed the time of their visitation. They had the opportunity to embrace a path of peace, but their leadership chose the path of violent rebellion and militant nationalism against Rome, which inevitably led to their absolute annihilation.
Later, in Luke 21, the disciples are walking around the temple, and they are marveling at the architecture. They are pointing out the goodly stones and the massive, wealthy gifts dedicated to the structure. And I think we do the exact same thing today.
Oh, absolutely.
We look at the goodly stones of our modern institutions. We look at our global financial systems, our massive tech conglomerates, our established governments, our military might. We assume they are permanent.
We think they'll last forever.
Right. We assume the script of civilization will just keep running smoothly. But Jesus is telling them that everything built by human hands is incredibly fragile. He warns them of coming wars, commotions, earthquakes, famines, and pestilences. And then he uses a phrase that feels like it was written this morning.
Yeah.
He says, men's hearts failing them for fear and for looking after those things which are coming on the earth.
Men's hearts failing them for fear. It is a chillingly accurate diagnosis of modern anxiety. We live in an era of unprecedented global connectivity, which means every crisis, every war, every economic dip, every political scandal is broadcast directly into our pockets 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
It's exhausting.
It is. It is incredibly easy to become paralyzed by the sheer volume of terrifying information. But right in the middle of this apocalyptic warning, Jesus delivers one of the most vital, transformative instructions in the entire text. In Luke 21:19, he says, "In your patience possess ye your souls."
In your patience possess ye your souls. What a fascinating phrase. Let's break down what that actually means for a listener today who feels overwhelmed by the chaos of the world.
Albert Barnes translates this concept as, "By your perseverance, preserve your lives or preserve your inner being." Matthew Henry interprets it as getting and keeping possession of your own mind.
Okay, keeping possession of your mind.
Right. It is about the locus of control. When the external world is experiencing earthquakes and commotions, when your industry is collapsing due to AI, when political turmoil is raging in your country, when...
But there are massive psychological obstacles to maintaining that kind of stability.
Yeah.
Jesus explicitly warns them about this in Luke 21:34. He says, "Take heed to yourselves, lest at any time your hearts be overcharged with surfeiting and drunkenness and cares of this life, and so that day come upon you unawares."
Yeah.
Modern listeners often resist facing anxiety clearly, and we tend to swing violently between two extremes.
Yes, the two extremes of dealing with an overwhelming world. The first is numbing. The text calls it surfeiting and drunkenness. Today, we might call it escapism.
Right, just checking out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
When the world is too scary, we binge content, we abuse substances, we consume endlessly just to drown out the noise and avoid reality. The second extreme is obsession. The text calls this the cares of life. This is when we become completely paralyzed by obsessive worry, trying to micromanage every possible future disaster.
And both of those extremes achieve the exact same negative result.
Yeah.
Your heart becomes overcharged, it becomes overloaded, you lose possession of your soul.
Precisely.
You are either too numb to respond wisely to the crisis, or you are too panicked to see the solutions clearly. You allow yourself to become a passive victim of the external chaos rather than a grounded, active presence within it.
That requires immense discipline, which brings us to the practical how-to for navigating crisis, the information diet.
Right. I want you to reflect today. Are the cares of this life acting like a snare to you right now? Is the constant 24/7 news cycle or the algorithm of your social media feed overloading your heart to the point where it is failing you for fear.
It's so easy for that to happen.
It really is. How can you actively practice possessing your soul this week? Maybe it means putting your phone in another room and turning off all notifications for 24 hours. Maybe it means setting a strict 15-minute daily limit on doom scrolling.
That's a great idea.
You cannot control the commotions of nations, and you cannot stop the geopolitical earthquakes, but you absolutely can and must guard the gates of your own mind.
That boundary setting is deeply necessary because in the narrative, the global and national crisis is about to violently narrow down into an intensely personal crisis. Jesus is about to enter the crucible of his own suffering. He is about to be forced to embody the very teachings on forgiveness, power, and patience that he has just delivered.
The sequence of events in Luke 22 and 23 moves at a brutal, rapid pace.
Yeah.
We see the agony in the Garden of Gethsemane. We see the betrayal by Judas with a kiss.
Heartbreaking.
We see Peter, one of his closest friends, vehemently denying he even knows Jesus 3 separate times out of sheer panic. And then the trials begin. Jesus is dragged before the religious council, then shipped off to Pilate, the Roman governor, then sent to Herod, and finally back to Pilate.
It's a circus.
It is. And the accusation the religious leaders finally land on to force Pilate's hand is purely political. They accuse Jesus of perverting the nation and forbidding the people to give tribute to Caesar.
Which is an incredibly dark irony, considering we just discussed how he explicitly told them to render to Caesar what is Caesar's. It is a complete subversion of justice. The religious leaders, who historically hated Caesar in the occupation, are suddenly pretending to be fiercely loyal subjects of the Roman Empire just to secure an execution.
It's so manipulative.
And through all of this, the false witnesses, the mockery, the physical beatings, one of the most striking elements is how Jesus responds, or rather how he doesn't respond. He is largely silent.
Hold on, I struggle with this part, and I think a lot of people do. If you or I were falsely accused of a capital crime, facing the death penalty for something we didn't do, our natural instinct would be to mount the most fiery, articulate legal defense possible.
Of course.
We would point out the blatant contradictions in the witnesses. We would scream about our rights. We would demand justice. But Jesus is incredibly passive here. He barely answers Pilate. When he is sent to Herod, who wants to see him perform a miracle like a parlor trick, Jesus answers him with absolute silence. Why? Why not fight back against a clearly rigged system?
What's fascinating here is that we have to look at the legal mechanics of that silence, because it is not passive weakness, it is a highly calculated moral stance.
Okay, explain that.
Under Roman law, specifically the cognitio extra ordinem process used in the provinces, a trial required an accusation, an interrogation, and a defense. If a defendant refused to mount a defense, a concept known as contumacia or contumacy, they could be found guilty simply by default for disrespecting the authority of the court.
So by staying silent, he is basically guaranteeing his own conviction.
Yes, but he is doing it to force the system to reveal its true nature. If he argues with them on their own terms, if he plays the legal game, he subtly validates their authority to judge him.
I see.
He treats it like a legitimate trial. By remaining entirely silent before Herod and giving only minimalist answers to Pilate, he is making a profound statement. I will not legitimize this corrupt tribunal with the defense. He forces Pilate to proceed with the execution of a man he repeatedly admits is innocent, entirely without the convenient cover of a messy, complicated legal defense. Jesus exposes the absolute moral bankruptcy of the systemic power. He voluntarily absorbs the ultimate injustice to break the cycle of human violence.
And that breaking of the cycle reaches its absolute apex on the cross itself. They lead him out to Calvary, they nail him to the wood, and in Luke 23:34, as he is hanging there, experiencing unimaginable physical agony, asphyxiation, and the ultimate betrayal by humanity, he utters his first words from the cross, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do."
Logic. Matthew Henry notes that one reason Jesus died the slow death of the cross was so he might have the liberty of speech to the very last moment, to glorify God and edify those around him. And his very first act with that agonizing breath is to pray for his murderers. Think about the implications of this. He does not wait for an apology. He does not demand that the Roman soldiers driving the nails or the religious leaders mocking him suddenly realize their error and beg for mercy before he extends forgiveness.
This is where we have to translate this ancient text into our 21st century realities, because radical forgiveness is the ultimate circuit breaker for human cycles of vengeance.
It really is.
When someone harms us, our deeply ingrained human instinct is retaliation. You hit me, I hit you back harder. You steal from me, I destroy your reputation. And that cycle just escalates indefinitely until families, communities, and entire societies tear themselves apart.
Right, it never ends.
By saying, Father, forgive them, Jesus is essentially absorbing the kinetic energy of human hatred and refusing to pass it on. He stops the cycle in his own body.
That is the core wisdom, but we must approach this with extreme discernment, because modern listeners often misunderstand forgiveness as weakness.
Yeah, they think it means just rolling over.
Exactly. Forgiving an oppressor does not mean validating the injustice. It does not mean pretending the harm didn't happen or ignoring the pain. It certainly does not mean removing the societal or legal consequences for the perpetrator.
Then what does it actually do?
What radical forgiveness does is free the victim's soul from being permanently tethered to the perpetrator. If you refuse to forgive, you remain chained to the person who hurt you.
That makes so much sense.
Their actions continue to dictate your emotional state, your anxiety, your worldview. They still have power over you. By forgiving them unilaterally without waiting for their repentance, you take back your own agency. You cut the chain. You possess your soul, just as he taught his disciples to do in the midst of crisis.
That is incredibly powerful. You aren't forgiving them to let them off the hook. You are forgiving them to take the hook out of your own heart.
Yeah.
Which brings us to our next practical application, the forgiveness release.
Yeah.
I want you to identify one area of deep resentment you are currently carrying. Think of someone who slighted you, betrayed you, or profoundly harmed you. What would it mean for you to unilaterally forgive that debt today?
Just let it go.
Not for their sake. They might not even know or care that they hurt you, and you may never need to speak to them again, but for your own sake. How can you release that resentment to protect your own peace, take back your agency, and stop the cycle of bitterness from echoing through your own life?
It is arguably the hardest psychological and spiritual work a human being can do, and it is exactly the kind of radical reinterpretation of reality that sets the stage for the final act of this narrative.
Right, because the story doesn't end there.
Exactly. After the crucifixion, after Jesus breathes his last, the disciples believed it was the definitive tragic end. The script was over. Everything was lost.
We move to Sunday, the third day. The atmosphere in Jerusalem is chaotic. Rumors are flying that the tomb where Jesus was buried is empty. Some women are claiming that angels have been seen declaring he is alive.
Yeah, total confusion.
But the disciples are in a state of profound shock, grief, and disbelief. They think it's nonsense. And we find two of them leaving. They're walking away from Jerusalem, heading to a village called Emmaus, which is about 7 miles away.
We are in Luke 24 now. These two disciples are walking and reasoning together, deeply sad. And the text says that Jesus himself draws near and walks with them. But there is a strange detail. Their eyes were holden that they should not know him.
He's undercover.
He is essentially walking incognito. He joins their conversation and asks them what they are debating and why they look so miserable.
And one of them, Cleopas, stops in his tracks and basically says, "Are you the only person in Jerusalem who doesn't know what just happened?"
Yeah.
And they proceed to pour out their completely shattered expectations to this stranger.
Yeah.
They recount how Jesus of Nazareth was a mighty prophet in deed and word. They explain how their own chief priests and rulers delivered him to be condemned to death and crucified him. And then they utter what might be the most heartbreaking phrase in the entire book. But we trusted that it had been he who should have redeemed Israel.
We trusted. Past tense. Their hope is categorically dead. You have to understand what their script was. They expected a political, military savior who would ride into Jerusalem, kick out the Roman legions, cleanse the temple by force, and set up a physical, earthly throne.
Right.
Because Jesus died on a Roman cross, the ultimate symbol of state domination in their minds, he categorically failed the Messiah test. The script they had written for God was torn to shreds.
This is the perfect analogy for a modern listener experiencing the collapse of a lifelong dream. You studied for a decade for a specialized career that suddenly evaporated due to market shifts.
Yeah.
You poured your absolute soul into a marriage that ended in a bitter divorce. You believed a certain path, a certain relationship, or a certain achievement would bring you ultimate fulfillment, and it led to a devastating dead end. It is that profound disorientation that occurs when life simply does not follow the script we wrote for it.
It's so painful.
We look at the broken pieces of our lives and say, I trusted that this was going to be the thing that saved me.
And we have to look closely at how Jesus responds to their grief. He doesn't immediately pull off the disguise and say, "Surprise, I'm alive, don't be sad."
Right. He doesn't just fix it instantly.
He doesn't offer them cheap comfort. Instead, he addresses their deeply flawed framework. He chides them. "O fools, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken, ought not Christ to have suffered these things and to enter into his glory?"
Calling them fools seems, I don't know, a bit harsh for two guys who are actively mourning their best friend.
Matthew Henry actually uses a fascinating old word to describe their condition here. Incogitancy. It means thoughtlessness or a cognitive block.
Okay.
Jesus isn't insulting their intelligence. He is pointing out their cognitive dissonance.
Mm-hmm.
They had read the ancient scriptures. They knew the texts, but they selectively ignored all the parts about a suffering servant. They only wanted the conquering king.
They only saw what they wanted to see.
Exactly. They couldn't synthesize the new information because it didn't fit their preferred narrative. So Jesus starts at Moses and the prophets, and he completely re-expounds the scriptures to them. He walks them through their own history, showing them that the tragedy they are mourning was actually a necessary part of the design. The cross wasn't an interruption of the plan, it was the mechanism of the plan.
He takes the event that they viewed as their ultimate devastating tragedy, and he reinterprets it as the ultimate victory. The very thing that shattered their expectations was the exact thing that purchased their redemption.
If we look at the psychological application of that, it means God often meets us in our exact moments of despair, but in a disguise we don't expect. He helps them reread their own history through a new lens.
How do we reread our own lives? That is the modern translation right there. Can our greatest failures, our deepest losses, our most agonizing dead ends be reinterpreted?
Yeah, that's the real question.
Can we look back at the things that broke us and realize they were the very crucibles that forged our deepest growth, our strongest empathy, and our ultimate resilience? That they were actually necessary for us to enter into whatever our true calling is.
It requires a massive paradigm shift. You have to be willing to let go of the script you wrote. And for these two disciples, that shift is finally solidified when they reach the village of Emmaus.
Right, they finally arrive.
It is getting late, so they urge this intelligent stranger to stay with them. They sit down at the table to eat. Jesus takes the bread, blesses it, and breaks it. And in that incredibly familiar action, an echo of the feeding of the thousands, and the Last Supper, the text says, their eyes were opened and they knew him.
The disguise is gone. The cognitive block is removed. And the moment they recognize him, the very second they realize who has been walking with them this entire time, he vanishes out of their sight.
Just like that.
They're left staring at an empty chair and broken bread. And they look at each other and say, "Did not our heart burn within us?" While he talked with us, by the way, and while he opened to us the scriptures.
Did not our heart burn within us? Matthew Henry comments on this specific phrase, noting that the teaching on the road didn't just bring cold intellectual light to their minds, it brought a divine heat to their souls.
A divine heat, wow.
It was an emotionally transformative resonance with the truth. They weren't just intellectually convinced of a theological point, they were set on fire from the inside out. The truth moved from their heads to their hearts.
Which brings us to our final practical how-to, seeking the burning heart. I want to ask you, the listener, are you settling for a cold, purely intellectual knowledge of your life, your philosophy, or your faith?
Yeah, are you just checking boxes?
You can know all the historical facts, you can understand the systemic blueprints, you can read all the commentaries, but are you actively looking for those moments of profound internal resonance? How can you seek out those burning heart moments where truth stops being abstract and becomes deeply emotionally transformative?
It takes effort.
Maybe it requires taking a long walk with someone who challenges your perspective. Maybe it means being willing to have your most cherished assumptions dismantled so you can see the truth more clearly.
And this leads to a final fascinating detail to leave you with regarding his sudden disappearance. Think about the fact that the very second the disciples finally recognize Jesus at the table in Emmaus, he vanishes.
Right. Why leave then?
After a 7-mile walk, after hours of profound teaching, why leave the exact moment they finally see him clearly? Perhaps it suggests that once we truly see and understand the truth, we don't need the physical hand-holding anymore. The realization of truth isn't meant to be a cozy, static moment where we just sit around a table feeling good forever. The clarity is meant to mobilize us.
It demands action. And what do? The text says they rose up that very same hour. It was dark, they were exhausted, they had just walked 7 miles away from the city, and they immediately turned around and walked all the way back to Jerusalem in the night to share what they had experienced with the others.
They couldn't wait.
The muddy waters of their profound despair were entirely replaced by the undeniable clarity of purpose. That's the heart of this section. This is wisdom for the present. where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.